Welcome to Planet People, a podcast that aims to inspire curiosity and cultivate a deeper connection with the natural world.
We are thrilled to be sharing stories with you that highlight the beauty and importance of protecting our planet's wildlife.
Be sure to follow us on social media and your favorite podcast streaming platform so that you never miss an episode.
Hi, Planet People, and hey, Natalie.
Hey, Coral. What's up, Planet People?
So this bonus episode is actually just a quick little snippet, and it came from one of our bird's eye view that we recorded for an episode that you have not heard yet. But we thought that it just gave a lot of context to something that's pretty central to our entire season 2, which is the Joshua Tree. We did a lot of records in Joshua Tree, and we love the Joshua Tree, and it was a huge inspiration to even start this season of Planet People. So this little tidbit gives you guys a really broad understanding of the Joshua Tree Conservation Act and everything that goes into it and what exactly it means.
I'm glad we're doing a bird's eye view segment, turning that into a bit of an episode here. I think the Joshua Tree does deserve more than just a little segment. So we hope you guys are interested in protecting the Joshua Tree and get a better understanding of what this policy looks like that is so important to protecting this iconic species of the desert and really a symbol of uniqueness, biodiversity, and so much more. And that's why we're so excited to bring you guys this shorter style episode, but hopefully it's informative and you'll get a better understanding of what it means to protect the Joshua Tree from things like climate change, renewables, housing, highway development, you name it. There's a whole list of things, and we need to use our voice to protect it. And there's no place in my heart that has a bigger spot than the Joshua Tree and desert tortoise. So we hope you enjoy it.
The Joshua Tree Conservation Act. Natalie, can you give us all the ins and outs about the Joshua Tree Conservation Act? Because I know that you were a conservationist on the ground for this exact Conservation Act.
Yeah, thanks, Coral. The Joshua Tree Conservation Act is really a pillar for modern day desert conservation movements, right? In the last 5 years, there's been a lot of current events going on with desert conservation as we see renewable energy upscaling in the desert. What does that look like? It looks like removing large swaths of land, including Joshua trees, the only vertical component on the landscape removed for the installation of solar farms, for man-made panels. And it's quite a jarring visual to see a beautiful desert landscape full of creosote, cholla, different species of cactus, cholla being one of them, the Joshua tree, and all of the different species that live in the desert, from lizards to snakes to the desert tortoise, insects, you name it. When we remove these aspects of the desert to install solar, then we see detrimental impacts start to take place. And that definitely happens when the Joshua Tree is not fully protected. I have seen it happen before the Joshua Tree Conservation Act came into law in 2023. And that's why it's so important to have this act, is to protect this vertical component in the desert, especially when developers are coming in and trying to tear out these trees.
They're pretty much the only trees that are around, right? Like, if not the only tree in this entire area.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah. And so that offers so many homes for different walks of wildlife and birds as well. And so taking out the only tree, it's like you're taking away the shade, you're taking away their home, you're truly taking away their habitat. And that's just not something that we can stand for, especially when this is the only place that you can ever find Joshua trees in the world.
Yes, that's true. And they're actually not a tree, technically. They're a yucca species. And you cannot age a Joshua tree because it does not have tree rings.
And we learned that in Colin's episode, where they are part of the asparagus family, which
That's
is
right.
crazy.
That's right.
Yeah.
So the Joshua Tree Conservation Act was signed into law in 2023. So like I said, this is relatively new in the grand scheme of recent current events with desert conservation. And it represents such an important approach to protecting one of the most iconic desert species. So not only does it face threats from solar energy, it faces threats from climate change, rising temperatures, and altered precipitation patterns that really push the species towards extinction, mostly across their entire range. And we'll begin to see Joshua trees try to migrate to higher elevations to avoid rising temperatures at those lower elevations in the desert. And they actually need a specific elevation to even occur. And that's why it's so important to protect them where they are. And this act does exactly that, while also outlining preventative measures we can take to address climate change. And a lot of that looks like replant efforts after fires have gone through, replanting Joshua trees with the hope that they'll start to grow. They have a very low survival rate, which is partly because of the harsh environments that they have to grow in, right? It's 99.99% of juvenile Joshua tree saplings don't survive. So it's important to take those preventative measures so we don't have to replant them. If we protect the ones that we have from climate change, from solar and other threats, then we have a better chance at seeing them in the future. Just to break this down a little bit more, the Western Joshua tree, Yucca brevifolia, was granted legislative protection through this passage of the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act as part of the state's Public Resources Trailer Bill. So this happened on July 10th in 2023, and it outlines that the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act needs to have all of these different segments in place for the act to really be powerful in its protective capabilities. And so it was developed through the candidacy for the listing of the Joshua tree under the California Endangered Species Act. So in 2021, it was listed and it had interim protection. So for 3 years, there was this ongoing debate about whether or not the Joshua tree should be listed under the California Endangered Species Act or have its own Conservation Act entirely, which is why the Joshua Tree Conservation Act is so iconic in itself, that this one tree has an act dedicated to its protection. Rather than it going under the broader California Endangered Species Act, it has its own protective status with its own act. And at first, this was considered, people were questioning if it would be powerful, right? If there were loopholes in place. And one of those loopholes, unfortunately, is that before the act was passed, there was already a lot of development projects underway that had the approval to remove Joshua trees before the act was created. And so all of these projects that are going up in the desert that have been in place prior to 2023 still have the granted access to remove Joshua trees, which is quite unfortunate. However, I will take the Kurt Leuschner approach here and be pragmatic in this approach that this is better than nothing. This is forward movement to protecting these trees from solar development, from housing, from highway development, all of these things where we are really encroaching into the Joshua tree's habitat. And so having this will prevent developers from grabbing every tree they can and instead leaving them in place and working around the landscape.
I love that. And just to clarify, the Western Joshua tree, it's different from the Eastern? And is the Eastern not protected?
Yes, that's a good question. The Eastern Joshua tree occurs in the Mojave National Preserve. So the further east you go towards Vegas, you'll start to notice a difference in the Western and Eastern Joshua tree. Their characteristics are quite different. I've noticed the Eastern Joshua tree looks much skinnier and has more branches that grow upright rather than out, whereas the Western Joshua tree looks more like a tree where the branches furl out into a big tree. So there are definitely some noticeable difference in each species. And yes, the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act only protects the Western species versus the Eastern species.
So as the eastern species, that's not protected at all.
It is not. However, I do believe it has been under severe threat from many fires in recent years, one of them being the Ceiba Dome fire, which burned like 1 million acres of the desert, and so many Joshua trees perished. And that was a stronghold for Joshua trees in general because of how high the elevation of Ceiba Dome is. And it's really a good indicator of where we could try to replant more Joshua trees in the future as kind of like a climate refuge. And there was the York fire too, which burned in, I think, Avi Kwame National Monument, where several hundred Joshua trees burned. The sheep fire in Wrightwood, California, burned the western Joshua tree. And so not only do we see threats to the Joshua tree come from things like development, but it's that climate change piece as well, where we're seeing wildfires in the desert happen, which do not naturally occur on the desert landscape. Most desert adapted trees will actually open up their seed pods when if a fire is burning, like let's say my point here is that fire is natural in some habitats and landscapes because the trees and seeds have adapted to still bloom after a fire has come through. Because fire has always been a part of the landscape, but not in the desert. It is not natural in the desert. It happens because of nitrogen that deposits in the soil, and it creates invasive grasses to grow unchecked. And those invasive grasses act as ground fuel for wildfires to spread across the desert at an unprecedented rate. And that nitrogen deposit comes from fossil fuels in the atmosphere. Those invasive grasses are introduced from trucks and cars that drive through and bring seeds into the area that weren't previously there. So again, we're seeing this introduced element of invasive grasses, climate change, fossil fuels. All of these things pose a threat to the Joshua tree. While this sounds daunting, this is why we have the act in place. That is the hope. That is the political action that we need for the desert right now. In real time, these things are happening right before my eyes. I have seen these fires. I have seen the aftermath of Ceiba Dome, of Wrightwood. I've had my boots on the ground planting Joshua tree saplings, and with the hopes that they'll just flourish one day. That's really what you have to take away from this act, is that hopefully we can do right by this tree, or this yucca species, so to speak.
I wonder if this also kind of gives a precedent to get the eastern Joshua tree also protected. Maybe they can be, whether it be like looped into this conservation act or its own conservation act, so that they can just all be protected. And doesn't this conservation act mandates like development owners to really pay more attention when developing on land? They have to work with the California Fish and Game Commission, governmental agencies, California Native tribes, which we hear about in Seth's episode, and also have public forums.
Yes, that is true, that private landowners do have to go through different agencies to receive approval to remove a Joshua tree from their land. And it's actually been quite a big controversy between private landowners and developers, and who has the biggest fine, the biggest slap on the wrist for taking out a Joshua tree. And a lot of landowners in the desert, in San Bernardino County, specifically where a lot of Joshua trees occur, do not want to be told what they can and cannot do with their land. And so it sparked this disagreement among locals of the desert and developers, and who was seeing a bigger fine for illegally removing Joshua trees, right? And so that's the social component here that we have to address to protect the Joshua tree from being removed. And another important part of the Joshua Tree Conservation Act is that it requires the Department of Fish and Game to submit an annual report that basically assesses the conservation status of the trees as of 2025. So there are many regulations in place. The Joshua Tree Conservation Act provides a lot of preventative measures that include limiting the threats of climate change, making sure there are more permits and regulations in place that developers have to comply with, targeting private landowners who have Joshua trees on their properties, doing all of these things to make sure that the species is protected is why this act is so iconic.
And while you were explaining this, honestly, I got a little teary-eyed because I have been on the sidelines watching you go to the desert for years, and you have so many iconic videos of you protesting in the middle of Joshua tree forests and just for this Conservation Act to be enacted. And then here we are years later, and we have the Conservation Act, which is amazing. I mean, like, I love seeing this change in real time, and you were a part of it. And I was cheering you on the sidelines. And, you know, I recreate in Joshua Tree all the time. I would absolutely hate to not be able to go there. And I really think if you're in LA, if you're in Southern California, like, it's such a rite of passage to go there.
So true.
I mean, I have friends that are there right now. Like, it's just, it is the place to go. It's so gorgeous. It's so unique. It's endemic to this area. And so it deserves and needs to be protected.
Period. Thanks so much for cheering me on the sidelines.
Yeah.
It makes me happy. That was a crazy time. I really fell in love with the Joshua tree when I started working in the desert around 2022. And I was living in Barstow, California at the time, a place that, if you're listening and you're a desert tortoise biologist, you are familiar with this area and the sheer number of tortoises that live in that region because of all of the undeveloped land make it a ripe spot for fun desert conservation work. And while it may not be the most pleasant place to stay, that's really where my story with the Joshua tree begins. And I'll never forget driving down Copper City Road. And this is kind of, you know, off the beaten path, so to speak, right? This is all BLM public land. So as you can imagine, and I'll set the stage, this is just a long dirt road. And on either side of me are Joshua trees everywhere. Dense Joshua tree forests with some of the biggest, most ripe Joshua trees I have ever seen in my life. And I've been to the Mojave National Preserve and to Joshua Tree National Park. And there's nowhere else like Copper City Road in Barstow where you can see some of the oldest and biggest Joshua trees. And I won't give any coordinates away, but if you know where to find it. It's not on a map, but maybe one day Planet People will take a little field trip to this said forest. And so driving down this road, you start to ingrain these dirt roads in your mind and remember where things are. Like, I could still take you to a spot where there are tortoises that live next to a Joshua tree. And so it's this experience of being on these dirt roads and just having huge trees towering over you. And that was my drive to work, you know, for 3 months every morning, 6 a.m. And I'm 2 hours from any type of pavement. So as you can imagine, it's far away from civilization where these forests are. And so around that time when I was doing this desert conservation work for the government as a tortoise biologist, there was a lot unfolding with desert conservation events. I kind of get into that a little bit as we talk about the act and how there's just so much on the forefront with desert conservation these last 5 years, and especially in 2022 when California was still in a mega drought. We hadn't seen any of those atmospheric river events that followed in 2023 and 2024. It was still very dry when I was starting to get this experience. So there were a lot of new things surfacing, one of them being the Joshua Tree Conservation Act, the desert tortoise. A lot of people in the desert tortoise space were trying to get it uplisted. And so now, fast forward to today, it has been uplisted from threatened to endangered. So anyways, all of these things, current events, are unfolding as I'm quite literally driving down these roads and contemplating, like, how are we going to leave these places? How are we going to protect them? What are we going to do about it? And I would talk to my colleagues about it. Like, we are really on the front lines of seeing devastating climate change effects, to the point where I had upper management telling me, you know, we need to collect every reptile in the desert and put it in a zoo. It doesn't matter if it's endangered or threatened. We need to document what's still here before it's too late. And so as a early career conservationist, you hear these things, and at least for me, I never let that go. And I just was hell-bent, really, on advocating on a bigger scale. No one was talking about the Joshua Tree, yet everyone was visiting Joshua Tree National Park during the pandemic. But the National Park Service isn't responsible for telling you about climate change or Joshua trees on a local level, right? Under the California Endangered Species Act, national parks are run by the federal government. So they're not concerned with what's going on at the state level. So they have no obligation as a federal entity to provide resources on what's going on with protecting it. So you have 4 million visitors going to Joshua Tree National Park that have no idea it's under threat from extinction. And so I get on social media and I am just nonstop talking about it that summer of 2022. I just couldn't believe that there's so much fame around this iconic species, from the U2 album, the Joshua Tree album, which we all know and love, at least I do. From the people visiting, the Airbnb explosion in the area. I mean, it was trending during the pandemic. So why the fuck was no one talking about what the hell was going on with it? And that's not to anyone else's fault, right? People just weren't educated. And so I went out there by myself. One day after work, I protested, just me, myself, and I, in the middle of nowhere, quite literally, like a place that you can't access because it was in a Western training area, like military secret zone. So I had no problem just recording myself and setting that up and just praying to Mother Nature and giving back for a second. Like, we need to protect this tree. And fast forward to today, the Joshua Tree has been not only listed as a candidate for being an endangered species under the California Endangered Species Act, but it's also, during that interim process, they decided that it wasn't suitable to be under the CESA. And instead, now it has its own Joshua Tree Conservation Act. But I can confidently say that I'm so glad I was advocating when I did, because hearing that news during such a extreme time with the mega drought, quite literally feeling like the extremes of climate, like 120 plus days way too early on in the season. So being on the front lines and knowing that my boots are on the ground and people are visiting the park and know about the tree and nothing is happening, like, it just felt like a ripe time to share. And now it's protected. Whether or not it's perfect or not, it's still protected. And now we get to talk about it on this season. And I hope you enjoyed that story because it's so near and dear to my heart. And it's just fun talking about the Joshua Tree. It really is just fun.
So speaking of fun, what are some good fun facts about the Joshua Tree?
Oh, that was the perfect lead in, and I didn't even try to do that. Fun facts about the Joshua Tree. Let's get into it.
Well, we already said one, which is they're a part of the Asparagus family, which Colin let us know, which is crazy.
I know. That's almost unbelievable, right?
Yeah, it really is.
Like, we were pretty jaw-dropped about that one, which is hilarious. Another fun fact is that Joshua trees are actually not a tree, which I think we discussed with Kurt Leuschner in his episode. And instead of being a tree, they're actually a yucca. And you can't age a Joshua tree because they don't have tree rings because they're not a tree. Another fun fact is that they're pretty prehistoric, and the only way that Joshua trees were able to grow is by the seed dispersal of a giant ground sloth. And so we also definitely talk about that in this season, but it's a pretty cool fun fact that Joshua trees have grown because of giant ground sloth basically consuming the seed and digesting it and pooping it out, and those seeds remain in that poop and then are released into the soil, and boom, you have a Joshua tree. That's also one of the greatest threats, though, to the Joshua tree survival. So it's a double-edged sword that now that giant ground sloths aren't alive, there isn't a primary mechanism for the Joshua tree seed to be dispersed. So it has to be dispersed through small mammals or birds or other things, but that's takes a pretty large effort.
Another fun fact is that they live a super long time. They often exceed 150 years, and some are in the wild and that they're estimated over 500 years old. So even though we don't know exactly how old they are, we do know that they are old.
Basically prehistoric. I mean, they've been around for so long. That's why we have to protect them.
Joshua trees are also slow growing trees, so they only grow about 2 to 3 inches a year. It's pretty slow growing, which is nice, I think, because they're kind of associated with the desert tortoise. So slow and steady wins the race at an average about 500 to even 1,000 years old. They also tend to grow from 15 to 40 feet tall, and they have a diameter of 1 to 3 feet. And like I said, they only grow 2 to 3 inches per year. So when you see a super tall one, you know that that's probably the best way to know how old a Joshua tree is exactly how tall it is.
That's a great point. And the number of branches it has, because it takes about 50 years to grow 10 meters. And so imagine that's not very tall. And then after that, they start to sprout the arms.
Speaking of arms, I think that's how they got their names is Mormon settlers thought that they looked like a man praying upwards. And so they named it Joshua.
It definitely came from like a religious sentiment when Western pioneers were settling in California and the greater Southwest, primarily linked to the biblical figure Joshua and his role in guiding Israelites into the Promised Land. So when Mormon settlers came out west, they named the tree after him, and kind of believing that its outstretched branches did in fact resemble hands in prayer, like you said.
So there's also the Joshua tree. What is it? Night moth? Joshua tree night moth?
There's the Joshua tree and the yucca moth. So
okay.
Originally I thought it was a night moth, but that's the night lizard. The Joshua tree has its own night lizard that is associated with living in the branches of dead Joshua trees.
Oh,
and
cool.
So it's really cool. If a Joshua tree falls over and dies, it's better to leave those branches untouched because it actually creates a whole network for other species to live in, including the desert night lizard. And in addition to other species using the Joshua tree, like the desert night lizard, there's also the yucca moth, which is pretty much can't survive without the Joshua tree because the yucca moth, well, they can't survive without each other, really. They have a symbiotic relationship in which the yucca moth pollinates the Joshua tree's flowers, and the Joshua tree provides a place for the yucca moth to lay its eggs. So this symbiotic relationship between the Joshua tree and yucca moth is actually an example of obligate mutualism. So back to my original point is that they basically can't survive without each other. So both species depend on one another for their survival. And that's just another reason to protect the Joshua tree because it provides fruit for the yucca moth to live and then go off and provide what other ecosystem service that moth does or just exists, right? Everything works in harmony with each other. And we see the Joshua tree as this really keystone species, meaning that it provides something else on a important scale for other species. That something else is their home. The night lizard needs those branches that are dying on the desert floor. The yucca moth needs Joshua tree seed pods to pollinate and survive. Everything works in harmony, and it's just another important measure to take when protecting the Joshua tree is to consider these different aspects of survival for all plants and all animals.
Oh, I guess we should also say that the yucca moth is a white moth. So it could almost look like a white butterfly, but it's really a moth.
Pretty.
Okay, freak or force for the yucca moth. What do we think? I think that they are forces of nature because to have an entire, like you are this tiny little moth, and then you have this giant tree that also provides so much for so many other animals and species. That to me is a force. Like you are this tiny little moth that does so much for the environment.
Right. I would say the yucca moth is also a force of nature because you can be small but mighty, right? And this little moth has a tree that it depends on. And the Joshua tree also depends on the yucca moth for its survival. So this tiny little moth is kind of a badass, right? Because of its symbiotic relationship, really, with the Joshua tree. They depend on each other, and I think that's cool. Another fun fact, I'll leave you guys with this, is not necessarily just about the Joshua Tree, but actually about Joshua Tree National Park as a whole, which I feel like is relevant since we are, talking about the Joshua Tree. So something that is worth noting, Joshua Tree National Park was once Joshua Tree National Monument. And so we see that conservation of the national monument come into play in 1936 by a woman named Minerva Hamilton Hoyt. And so she was a key figure in establishing the monument, which is now Joshua Tree National Park. She really championed preserving the desert landscape and its unique flora and fauna at a time when there were a lot of people who thought Joshua trees were some of the ugliest trees they had ever seen. That's quite literally a quote in a book I have about Joshua trees, that early settlers who first came out west and saw Joshua trees were disgusted by them, except we have outliers like Minerva Hoyt who loved protecting the uniqueness of the deserts. So we owe her a huge kudos. Little fun fact for the national park and how it was created. In addition to Western pioneers, we also have the original stewards of the land that have been stewarding the landscape since time immemorial. Those include desert Native American communities like the Serrano, Coahuila, Chemehuevi, and Mojave communities that call the Joshua Tree National Park really part of their traditional ancestral homelands. And these groups settled around springs, they harvested the land, created thriving communities, and developed deep connections to and knowledge of the desert environment, which is really where that indigenous knowledge, that traditional ecological knowledge comes in to guide us. It should really guide modern day conservation efforts, and we are starting to finally see a transition into that movement, especially after Deb Haaland was in office. I know that's not the case with the federal government at this moment in time, but it was progress, and we are still moving in a good direction of giving the land back to these indigenous communities. We saw that with the Avi Kwame National Monument, the Chuckwalla National Monument. These are all milestones in desert conservation where Native American communities will have that preserved for generations to come. And some of these cultural resources that are so important to protect in places like national parks and national monuments can be exhibited at the park's archaeological collection. So if you're interested in learning more about Native American heritage and their ties to the Mojave, then you can begin to understand it at places like a visitor center where there's an extensive assemblage of Native American cultural history collected in the past without tribal community input. But today, park researchers and construction projects are planned collaboratively with these Native American communities to document and protect archaeological sites and really minimize the removal of cultural materials. And this is evident in kind of like a best practice for modern day work outside, whether it's consulting, development, anything. And we kind of get into that with Seth's episode a little bit and what that means to protect resources on the ground today.
So anxiety into action, I feel like this is an obvious one. If you see something that you feel that needs to be protected, advocate online. Spread that message. It's
genuinely fun.
Yeah, I think that you went viral for a few of the posts, which is really awesome because like you said, there's like 4 million visitors, especially during the pandemic. Everyone was going to Joshua Tree to get out of the city, to get some fresh air. And everyone that I told about the threats that they were under, nobody knew. So by using your voice and going on social media, and if you are being a tourist in these areas, maybe just do some research, ask around. If you are there at the national parks, talk to a ranger. If you're at a state park, talk to a ranger and learn about and ask very specific questions, like learn about the biology of these different species, but ask questions. What kind of threats are they under and what can I do?
The best thing I can suggest for this anxiety into action piece is to simply go and sit underneath a Joshua tree. Sit in the presence of this tree, feel the shade that it provides, look up and see the perspective of these pointy spines above me, and observe what comes to the tree. What birds are perching? Perhaps a red-tailed hawk, maybe a common raven. Maybe you're lucky enough to see the yucca moth. Or even better, there might be a desert tortoise waiting in the shade. I have approached many Joshua trees with desert tortoise sitting in the shade of the tree. And it's a beautiful thing because there's no other shade component in the desert unless you are going beneath the surface, which at that point it's just dark and cooler there for most reptiles. So just sit and observe.
And if you do come across a desert tortoise, please do not touch it.
If it's underneath a car or in the road and it's in imminent threat of death, then please relocate it with care and hold it low to the ground. Don't pick it up high because they're already a very ground-dwelling species. So hold it low and steady to the ground and wear gloves if you can find them, because we really want to make sure we aren't preventing any transfer of some type of disease, whether it's from your pet to the tortoise or from the tortoise to something else. You have to be careful of transferring any type of disease because something introduced to a population of tortoises like that could wipe out a whole local population. It is not uncommon for that to happen. And so, and the same goes for Joshua trees. Do not pick up a Joshua tree sapling. Do not poach it from the desert. I've actually come across a small little mini axe when I was on a trail in Joshua Tree National Park. And we took it with us because we thought people were whacking down plants to poach, which is not uncommon. Wow. So anyways, don't poach.
If you go to Joshua Tree, please enjoy with care and respect. And let us know what kinds of breath of fresh airs that you guys have had in Joshua Tree. I know that there's plenty of people out there listening that have had their own special moments in Joshua Tree. Like I said in this episode, it is a rite of passage if you are in Southern California. So let us know your Joshua Tree experiences. Tag us on Instagram and show us your stuff in Joshua Tree.
Thanks, Planet People. Hope you guys loved this episode of this impromptu episode, I might add, because this was just supposed to be a segment. But let's be real, the Joshua Tree needed its own episode. And I could go on and on because obviously I love the Joshua Tree and we love it. And we hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Planet People. We are thrilled to have you as part of our community of wildlifers who care about protecting the planet for future generations to enjoy.
We hope that by listening, you feel inspired to connect with nature and become a steward of the planet by getting involved and taking action with your local community conservation organizations. Until next time, stay positive, Planet People.
This episode was produced by Natalie Jean Sybil, Coral Carson, and Hugh Carr. Directed and edited by Coral Carson. Theme song by Hugh Carr under the artist name Flama. Thank you, team.